I was left with my grandfather. He didn't look like he was any closer to God. His flesh creaking like the boughs of a tree. I might not have recognized what I was looking at if he hadn't whimpered at my light. I'd only met him once before that. I was about 10 or so. I had no idea about this strange man who turned up claiming he was my grandfather. For someone who believed cavemen rode dinosaurs, Elijah wasn't as weird as you might think. He tracked us down when I was 13 and came over to Britain to visit us. Dad had never mentioned his biological father, and while the old man seemed regretful about the lost time, he didn't sit around crying about it either. He was courteous but distant throughout, and he and Dad parted ways after those 2 days and never spoke again. At least, not in person. He did invite us to see him someday in Texas as he left, but it never happened. Other than that, I remember that he sat me down one night to talk me through my maths textbook, told me about imaginary numbers and string theory. Heavy stuff, but he made it accessible through his simple yet earnest passion. It was only after he'd gone that Dad told me the old man was a young Earth creationist, believed the Earth was around 6,000 years old, and that every last solemn word in the Bible was meant to be taken literally. 28 years later, and I was standing in the lobby of Elijah's privately owned museum that had passed to me after my father's death. Dad had never told me about either the museum or Elijah's own passing, but going through his estate turned it up, and I was as surprised as anyone to find out I was now the owner of 60 acres on the other side of the world. The whole place was dedicated to teaching biblical science of the world's creation. I saw stone slabs with human footprints displayed like great treasures, some of them 16 inches heel to toe, and with little placards explaining that the rocks were proof of humans coexisting with dinosaurs. There was a whole jungle room with plastic caveman versions of Adam and Eve crouched over paper cutout fire, while on the opposite side of the room, a badly made stegosaurus watched Cain push Abel to the ground. Although the most ludicrous was the one where two generic-looking cavemen used raptor claws to harvest wheat. It was imaginative, I'll give him that, but it wasn't especially convincing. How or why Elijah was so obsessed with creationism was something of a puzzle to me. He'd begun his career with a PhD in mathematics and a short stint teaching at a local college, and part of the reason I spent so much time in that museum packing up his things was to try and figure him out. During that time, I learned 3 key things. First, Elijah argued furiously with every other creationist he could find and burned every bridge there was. Without their support, he had almost no visitors during the 30 years the museum was open. The second was a cutout of a newspaper I found on Elijah's desk showing him grinning next to a dinosaur footprint. The article talked about how he'd gotten lost in the wilderness and taken refuge in a cave full of old fossils. I recognized the land in that photo as the place he'd later built his museum on, so it must have been important to him. I hadn't seen any cave in my wanderings though, but I figured if I kept looking, I'd come across it sooner or later. The final piece of the puzzle was Elijah's letter to my grandmother. I never knew he'd reached out to her. All we knew was she slept with some American GI and never wanted to see or speak to him again. The letter was a proposal, and I was initially surprised she'd shown no interest. Elijah was wealthy, intelligent, hard-working, and, based on his photos, a good-looking and athletic man. But then I got to the last page or so. Ethel, I can offer you more than just a good life. I can offer you an eternal one. I'm sure I told you about the time I hurt my leg hiking in the wilderness and was forced to take shelter in a cave until the storm passed. There, I found many strange and curious fossils, and I took the first steps on this strange hobby of mine. But what I haven't told the others is that I saw more than just a few old rocks. I found a way down, 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 down. Ethel, I went deep in the earth, and there I found a paradise, a piece of the world that had been preserved as it was before the great flood. And I saw early man still living as he did in the days of Eden, 10 feet tall and 1,000 years old, and speaking the tongue of God handed down before the fall of Babel. One of these great men sat me down and told me the secret histories of the world. I have kept this knowledge to myself for so long, but I know I can change the world, and it begins with this new book I'm writing. After that, a museum to display all the proof I've gathered. It isn't just about history, Ethel. It's the future that's at stake. Down there, I learned how to put a stop to it all. The wars and the fighting, hunger and deprivation. It can all be a thing of the past, and I believe it's God's will I do this. I can change the world, Ethel. I want you by my side when I do it. There it is, I muttered quietly to myself as I read the letter by the dim light of Elijah's old desk lamp. That was why my grandmother had not responded to his letters, and why my father did not meet his father until Elijah tracked him down decades later. 6 weeks in the dusty ruins of Elijah's seldom visited museum, and I finally felt like I understood my grandfather. Intelligent, stubborn, possibly mentally ill. Over the next few days, I continued to pack up his things and found myself often feeling sorry for him. It was lonely out there, and it made me uncomfortable to think of how an old man painstakingly painted little plaques no one wanted to read, or planning the best place to build public toilets for field trips that never came. And he just kept at it, right until the end. It was like I was walking around the physical manifestation of someone's delusions. But then I found the door behind the bookcase, and I discovered that Elijah had built 2 museums. The whole time I'd been in that place, I felt a kind of quiet unease, but I'd put it down to the circumstances. Packing up a dead man's things, or so I thought. But as soon as I pulled on that little locking mechanism and the shelf popped free with a puff of stale air, I understood I'd been sensing something else entirely. It was the darkness that stood out to me, or maybe the smell. Hard to say, since I'd never breathed air like it before or since. And looking back, I think I might be overstating just how black the darkness at the bottom of those stairs really was. But just the sight of it made something inside me want to turn and run. Not just out of the building, but out of the damn country, back to the airport and home again. I had no idea what was going to be down there, but for some reason, I was scared witless. Just the dark, I told myself, before forcing one foot in front of the other and making my way down. Wasn't far before the plaster chipped away and there was nothing but bare rock for walls. Turns out I hadn't been able to find the cave on Elijah's land because he'd built the museum on top of it. And down there, in a large chamber bigger than most school gyms, was a whole other set of displays. 8 large glass tanks, each one bigger than a car. I quickly realized what I'd been smelling the whole time was formaldehyde, and it had turned those glass tanks into green and murky pits where my light revealed only the occasional glimpse of what lay within. Whatever Elijah was planning on showing off down here, it wasn't fossilized rocks. There was flesh and bone in there, exposed muscle, all white and wriggly. I moved quickly at first, shining my light into each one and squinting. I was skittish and in a hurry, not sure what I was going to find. But then I looked into one and saw a fist-sized eyeball staring back at me, and I cried out in terror. It was the suddenness of it that got me. That, and it was housed in a socket of rotting flesh, unfamiliar in colour and shape. Couldn't have told you if it belonged to something that slithered, swam or flew. But as I walked around the case, I did find a hand curled up in one corner with fingers all different lengths and shapes. What was Elijah planning to do down there in that hidden room? There were no plaques, no explanations, only those 8 tanks that took up most of the enormous space, each one raised so the bottom was about chest height, ready for someone to wander around and marvel at God knows what. The floor had been covered in marble, so he clearly had grand ambitions. Now, there was only dust and sandy pebbles littering the floor. But everything upstairs had been hokey and cheap, the kind of evidence that was going to convince the already convinced. But down there, in the dark, where I could just make out the great shapes floating in the murky dark, there was the sense of something electric in the air, a feeling of revelation that wormed its way up through the ground, through my feet, and into my chest, where it settled like a kind of slow panic. I couldn't stop myself wondering about Elijah's belief and how it factored into that strange place. What had he preserved for decades in that chemical filth? I left after only 10 minutes and returned to the normal world above, where I spent a good hour sitting in the sun, hoping the Texan warmth would purge the dirty feeling that dark room had left me with. I briefly made arrangements to return home, but quickly cancelled. Elijah was insane, so I told myself. But there was something down there, and it was a damn sight more compelling than a bunch of cheap forgeries. That night, I stayed in the same room I always had, and lay tossing and turning beneath the moonlight, unable and unwilling to simply let the thoughts of that room fade away. I was wide awake when I heard the sound of something moving around the rooms below. I was alone out there, far from civilization. The sheriff had spoken to me a fair bit about trying to get a hotel, and for the first time, I wished I'd taken his advice. He was mainly concerned about squatters, and that's what I told myself must be out there. Despite the danger, I got up to check on it anyway. The thought of a whole night spent holed up in that room, waiting for some crack addict to come stumbling in, didn't seem much better than going out there and confronting them. But of course, there was more to it than that. I had strange ideas floating in my head, left over from the short time I'd spent wandering those great glass displays. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw images of strange shadowed things floating within. I wanted to bury those thoughts as quickly as possible and put an end to fancy notions of monsters lurking in the dark. At first, the museum looked much like it always had. There were boxes of artifacts and books I'd spent the last few weeks putting away, and quite a few displays still left standing from where I'd yet to get to them. In the jungle room, I walked past those funny-looking cavemen and plastic dinosaurs, hiding behind fake ferns and stopped briefly to examine the serpent that tempted passers-by with an apple in its child-sized fist. It was a cheap-looking creation with a strange childlike face rendered in fiberglass scales and beady yellow eyes. I disliked it from day one, and catching it in the dark that night made me hate it even more. But this time I stopped and reread the plaque beneath. I remembered the words Elijah had written for it, and at the time I dismissed them. But some strange feeling made me revisit them in that moment. Creatures alive today, such as snakes and lizards, looked very different under conditions of the pre-flood world, where the air was alive with powerful static and water did not fall from the sky but seeped upwards from the ground as a kind of condensation. The serpent was probably not like any snake we'd see today, but perhaps an altogether different creature whose bones continued to confound the non-believer scientists who studied them. Only through the Bible can we realize what such fossils truly represent. This is only one interpretation of what the serpent that tempted Eve may have looked like. When I looked up, another pair of eyes were gazing at me from over the mannequin's shoulder. I could not see the face that hid behind the fake plant, but there was no denying the two yellow, reflective points that fixed me momentarily before blinking, one at a time. I froze, terrified by such primal sight as a pair of predatory eyes gazing at me from the dark, and watched in terror as they slinked away and disappeared entirely. There followed the sounds of a few rapid and wet footfalls across the tiled floor as something in that room crawled quietly into the shadows. That night, I barricaded my bedroom door, and come morning, when I felt a little braver in the daylight, I checked the jungle room and found wet and slimy tracks leading to Elijah's office, where they disappeared behind the bookcase and into the cave below. It was crazy, I told myself. All of it was madness. But I couldn't shake my curiosity. And if you were me, you wouldn't have been able to either. This was like seeing the ice wall in the Arctic, proof of some mad conspiratorial gibberish that we've all been peddled for years through rapid-fire YouTubers who talk about flat earths and giants under the pyramids. It was as if I'd felt what Elijah had spoken of. The air really was electric down there. The ground was different. But as much as I hated to even give his beliefs the tiniest iota of credit, I could think of no other way to describe it than I had briefly stood in the conditions of another, older world. I had to make sense of it. I'd spent weeks putting away badly made fakes and forgeries, footprints with visible tool marks, badly arranged dinosaur bones, and dioramas of raptors in Noah's Ark. Elijah had found something all right, but I was certain it wasn't proof of his worldview. I just had to understand it on my own terms. Despite every bit of apprehension, I went back down the staircase. This time I took a crowbar and slipped a claw hammer in one belt loop just in case. I also brought a few wired floodlights and set about lighting that main room up so I could get a proper look. It didn't help me see what was in those cases any better. If anything, the bright light scattered even harder in the filth, and it all looked like a kind of pale green jelly. But I did find two doors I hadn't noticed the last time. One was a simple wooden one that led into a small closet full of old journals and cassettes. The other was like a metal bulkhead, the kind that would be used on a ship to seal a flooding hallway. I knew at some point I was going behind that door, but for the time being I settled for reading some of Elijah's old journals. It seemed like the easier of the two options. Specimen 1. Rat. Failure. Died after only a few hours. Preserved and put aside for further investigation. Specimen 2. Sheep. Partial failure. The wool continued to grow at unusual pace. Small buds. Flowers? We'll see. Preserved and put aside for further investigation. Specimen 3. Cow. Failure. If size is anything to go by, the ark must have been colossal. Perhaps these creatures are the origins of the fossils so many scientists attribute to woolly mammoths. Attempted dissection, but proved too difficult. Specimen has been preserved and put aside for further investigation. Specimen 4. Spider. Successful. A truly prehistoric creature. It returned to its aquatic roots and lived for many days in its tank before dying during an escape attempt. To think these creatures once swam in the oceans. I have preserved the specimen for further investigation. Specimen 5. Lizard. Success. The primitive attempts at speech were a promising sign. Euthanizing it proved difficult, but ultimately necessary. The things it said could not have been permitted in a God-fearing society. Preserved for further investigation. Specimen 6. Cactus houseplant. Success? Question marks? Relatively unchanged in outward appearance, but dissection revealed the insides had developed a meat-like appearance. Continues to grow despite best efforts. Preserved in the hopes the formaldehyde will kill it, but must keep a close eye on its display. Specimen 7. Blue catfish. Success. The origins of the great Leviathan perhaps lie within creatures such as this. Its growth was extraordinary, and it will be a struggle to fit the beast inside one of the displays. I do not envy the ancient sailors who encountered one of these in open waters. Specimen 8. Sparrow. Failure. Dreadful mistake. Euthanized itself while screaming obscenities. The things it said were extremely blasphemous. Preserved and put aside for further investigation. Specimen 9. Despite my best efforts, exposure to pre-flood conditions has begun to affect me. I'll have to join the great men below, if they will have me. I will not be able to continue my great work, and that saddens me deeply. Not a success, but not a failure either. At least I can take solace in knowing this will bring me closer to God. I looked at the tanks and suppressed a shudder. Were these Elijah's failed experiments? And if so, what on earth had he been doing to them? There was no scientific equipment down there, no mad scientist laboratory with bubbling vials and buzzing Tesla coils. That eye had been the size of a cantaloupe, and could not have belonged to anything on that list, at least not in its natural state. But Elijah's notes hinted strongly at him having changed them somehow. A kind of mutation, I wondered, perhaps even a form of radiation. For a moment, I considered going through the rest of the notes, but that was just delaying the inevitable. I was impatient, curious, and desperate to make sense of these things. So I approached the great metal door and reached for the lock, but hesitated when I heard a sound on the other side, a gentle susurration. I leaned forward and listened intently as I could. Jacob, open the door. It was not a sound. It wasn't. I could not tell you the timbre of the voice, the volume or language. It had none of those things. It was inside me, and it hurt like hell. A hammer swing to my cortex that left my mind ringing. My sight turned into a slideshow. Blood sprayed from my nose and mouth. The floor was suddenly inches from my face, and then my hands were reaching for the locking wheel. I dragged myself to my feet and gripped it steadily. I was going to open it, even as my mind finally caught up and I was flooded with a terrible panic, a desperate feral need to get out of there. But I couldn't stop myself. Resisting became a kind of physical impossibility, as out of bounds as flying or walking on the ceiling. The loss of control was haunting, and I would have opened that door were it not for the sound of splashing water behind me. Something about it scared me enough that the spell was broken and I regained some of my senses. I managed to glance behind me, and my light caught a glimmer of something black and oily slithering in one of the tanks. That sight alone turned my blood to ice, but it still paled in comparison to the force radiating from beyond that door. I could feel it still there on the other side, a white-hot aura of domination that threatened to unravel me like a piece of thread. I'd never experienced anything like it before, the kind of terror that nearly had me mewing like a beaten child. Before that thing could speak again, I ran, screaming from that room, and out into the open air, where the shock finally hit my nervous system like a freight train, and I passed out.
I just got my campus gearbox from campus.edu's online business degree program, and here's what they sent me for free. The packaging is super cool and clean, and when you open it, a free new laptop. We also get school swag that I'd actually wear, like this shirt and this hat. With their live online classes, I get to learn from professors who also teach at...
When I woke up, my mouth was gummy with dried blood, and the sun had burned me badly on one side. A black boot was nudging me gently in the side. "You okay down there?" I looked up, and a policeman I'd once spoken to not long after arriving in Texas was squinting down at me. I just about managed to remember that Wheeler was his name. "You need help, pal?" he repeated, and I tried to answer, but got a mouthful of dust. It wasn't until I sat upright and coughed most of the dust back up that I managed some kind of response. "No, I'm not okay." "No sign of a break-in." I looked over to see another officer step out of the museum. "Someone attack?" Wheeler asked. "Who was it? Crackhead? Sheriff told you it was a bad idea to stay out here all alone." "We gotta get out of here." The deputy put a hand on his holster and unclipped it. "Don't you worry, you're safe now," he said. "Rifle through your things," the second officer added as he arrived beside Wheeler. "We'll need you to come look and see if anything's missing." No, I said, stumbling to my feet. "No, we gotta go. We gotta leave. Take me to the airport." "Calm down now," Wheeler said as the two men exchanged a funny look. "You ain't even got your passport. Why don't we go in and take a moment? Maybe let us get a statement. Besides, Taylor and Keener have done a thorough sweep of the place, right?" "Yep," the other man smiled. I think he was trying to reassure me. "Taylor's just finishing up in that basement. Elijah sure was a funny fella, hiding all that down there." No, I stammered, while moving towards the parking lot. We gotta leave now. There's something..." "You planning on walking out of here?" Wheeler's hand was on my arm, looking concerned more than angry, which gave me pause. "Whoever left you in the dirt, smash the hell out of your car," he added. "That thing ain't going nowhere. Look, we'll give you a ride, but first things first, let's go inside and get a couple of your things." Dejected, I let them lead me back inside before I made a beeline to my room. I didn't do much packing. A single suitcase with everything I needed to get out of that damn place and back home. I also took a minute to call my wife and let her know I was fine. My failure to call her at the regular time had led her to phoning the police. Without that, I don't know how things would have panned out. At the time, I was deeply thankful just to have her looking out for me, and all I wanted in the world was to get back to her and put an end to the whole weird episode. As soon as I was packed, I ran back downstairs where I found Wheeler, who was ready to enter Elijah's office. "Keen went to get Taylor a short while ago," he said, "getting tired of waiting, so you just stay here while I go round him up." Before I could beg him to stop, he stepped inside and I raced after him. But I was too late. By the time I reached the stairs, the only sign of him was the light of his torch already fading. With him went the keys to the only working car in that place. I had no choice but to follow. As soon as I took the first step down, I felt that strange but familiar energy. Only this time, it seemed 1,000 times more powerful. It thrummed through the air like a kind of vibration. Sound seemed both muted and amplified. My footsteps were silent, but my breath was like thunder. The effect was claustrophobic, like the world was closing in on me. By the time I arrived at the bottom, I'd already felt like it was too late to turn back. I nearly cried out when I saw that the great metal door was already open. No sign of the men. Formaldehyde lay pooling on the floor where it mixed slowly with a puddle of fresh blood, although I had no idea who it belonged to. The tanks remained intact, which I was thankful for, but it troubled me to think of how that fluid got splashed around so violently. And the lights I set up had been knocked over in what must have been some kind of struggle, and now they cast long and frightening shadows. Wheeler had never been more than a couple seconds ahead of me, and yet he was nowhere to be seen in that room. But I already knew that every question racing through my mind could be traced to a single place. Where had the men gone? What had caused such violence and mayhem? Why are my ears ringing? Why are my feet moving of their own accord? What had Elijah found in the wilderness? What had changed those animals? What had spoken to me from the other side of a foot-thick steel doorway? What had compelled me to be drawn helplessly towards the strange and corpulent mist that rolled out of that black abyss and beckoned me deeper into the depths of the earth? The answer to every one of those questions was the same, and it was all due to the force that lived on the other side of that door. It must have surely affected the policeman in the same way it affected me. I was no more than halfway across the room when it felt like I was actually falling towards an open vault. After I crossed the threshold, I seemed to lose all sense of time and self. God knows what it must have been like for Elijah all those years ago, lost in the wilderness. I don't know what it was he found, but I still think he was mad and naive to genuinely think it was anything to do with God. Even now, glimpses of the journey down echo in my mind like snapshots in the dark. I remember heat and light. I remember pale mist that curled around my feet, lit within by some impossible light. I remember wandering vast caves larger than any stadium. But most of all, I remember the air and the way it crackled with skittish electricity. I could feel it across my skin like a gentle sunburn. There were buildings down there, and as I went deeper over what might have been hours or maybe even days, I saw the air filled with glowing mist so bright it was more like day than night. And it was in one of those buildings I found my long-lost grandfather. Or what was left of him, I guess. Of course, I say that. But he was alive. He made noises, so he must have been alive. The building was enormous, larger than even the cave above, but poor Elijah had still grown to take up nearly a third of it. He'd grown taller, like he believed would happen, and I bet he was longer lived too. But I don't think the conditions of that cave had made him into something divine. If anything, he looked to me like he was breaking down, melting in slow motion. Made me think of the elephant's foot in Chernobyl. Someone or something had also staked bits of him into place and tied some of his limbs to the vast rocky beams that supported the building's ceiling. There was a touch of cruelty about it that I couldn't quite place at the time, but would later attribute to the brands burned into his flesh at semi-regular intervals. If he had a mouth, I've no doubt he would have begged me to kill him. But my mind was not my own at that time, and I left that place and went back to wandering the mist in search of something I could not understand. I was merely compelled to go deeper towards some strange force that beckoned me onwards, working my feet and body like I was nothing more but a puppet. Eventually, during my journey, I heard a voice. He was wailing and sobbing, and he came screaming out of the mist and ran right into me. Something about the collision shocked both of us enough that it seemed to break the cave's effect on us. He looked as surprised to see me as I was to see him, and for a brief moment we both lay on the floor and stammered desperately in an attempt to speak. Eventually, I managed to ask what the hell had happened, but he jumped on top of me and clamped a hand around my mouth. He held me there for a few seconds, his wide, terrified eyes imploring me to stay quiet. And then I heard the footfalls of a giant, and I felt its mind looking for us. And I caught glimpses of the world as remembered by that man-shaped creature, the contents of its mind spilling outwards into me. I saw the Great Flood, the Ark, a world with wandering seraphim and the Great Tannin, the Behemoth and Leviathan. But more than that, I felt a kind of seething contempt in his feelings towards us, a burning disdain for the lesser race that had inherited the surface. I don't know how to fully describe it, but whatever that thing was, I don't know how Elijah could have possibly mistaken it for benevolent. Perhaps he had seen only what he wanted to. Perhaps it had read within him a desperate need to believe and used that to manipulate him. God knows what would have happened if Elijah had actually managed to fill that hidden room with people and open the door. Whatever lived within that cave would have had 10 times the number of victims it had claimed so far. Only Elijah's arrogance and obstinance had saved him from playing right into its hands. Eventually, the creature moved away from us. I'm not sure how or why it couldn't find us. The spell it cast seemed to come and go, and in that moment, the only thing I could be sure of was that once free, I had every intention of getting the hell out of there. Wheeler and I seemed to share this understanding, because as soon as it was safe to, he let me go, and the two of us wordlessly began to skulk back the way we came. It wasn't as long back as I feared it might be, although it's still hard to be sure of the time. What I can be sure of is that it was a special kind of nightmare to leave that place. The mist made it impossible to navigate, and if it wasn't for the tracks we'd left in the strange wet ground, we would have been lost forever down there. Even then, we often got waylaid and had to take hours just to find our way back to the track. And more than once, we found ourselves forced to hide in crevices and caves as terrible things drifted close in the fog, drawn perhaps by our scent or some other strange force. But eventually, we found ourselves hiking upwards at a steep and familiar incline where the mist thinned out almost entirely. By the time we were finally stumbling back out into the hidden room with the glass tanks, I had managed to grow a fair bit of stubble, and I noticed that what was once fresh blood had now congealed into a dark, rust-coloured brown. At a guess, we were down there for a good 2 or 3 days. I'm only thankful our memories of it were so broken. Wheeler almost immediately made a beeline for the exit, but I grabbed him and pulled him back. "The door," I gasped, while grabbing the locking wheel and trying to push it shut. But I was weak, and it took both of us trying with all our might to finally swing it closed. Once the mechanism clicked into place, I tried to turn and run, but something in me gave out, and I collapsed to my knees, where I began to heave and cry. Wheeler placed one hand on my shoulder and slowly pulled me back to my feet. "What the hell was your grandfather up to out here?" he moaned as we both limped towards the exit. "God knows," I muttered, and as I placed my foot on the first step up, I felt the deepest relief I've ever known flood through my body. "Wake up." The voice was as clear as day, but this time there was no pain. I looked to Wheeler to confirm that he'd heard it too, and sure enough, he was staring at me with a horrified expression. But the command made no sense, and it seemed to be distant, almost thinned. Was it the distance, I wondered, or the door? Elijah must have put the barrier there for a reason, but I couldn't be sure that was the only reason that the voice felt different somehow. But then I heard the sound behind me, and I realized why those words had been so strange. The command wasn't meant for us. The glass tankers broke one by one, and Wheeler and I both turned to see the room flood with formaldehyde and slick, oily flesh. The smell alone was enough to make me recoil and cry out. But then I saw them. The creatures within. God, most of them merely thrashed around. I don't know what that was. I simply don't know. Something fish-like, I suppose. Screamed in an almost human voice and rolled around in the slick waters. Another thing was pulling apart its face with a starfish-shaped hand. One was just a pile of legs that wrapped around the central mass. But one of them was rising to its feet. 2 yellow eyes glaring back at me from the dark, the irises glowing with a sickly rage. It almost looked human. Before I had time to react, the creature leapt at both of us and sent us both sprawling onto the steps where I hit my head. For a few terrifying moments, I felt myself being dragged slowly down into that disgusting liquid, where strange tentacles and insectile legs thrashed violently for some kind of purchase. I remember something hairy and chitinous brushing against my cheek, and the disgusting sensation was enough to bring me back to my senses. When I looked over to where Wheeler was being pulled right beside me, he was semi-conscious and groaning, and I realized it was up to me to try and get us out of there. I kicked violently at the strange thing pulling us. It was smaller than I thought, a bit bigger than most children, but it held onto my leg with an iron grip. But my movement woke Wheeler, who, finally coming around, began to fight back. Both of us kicked as violently as we could and seemed to enrage the monster that was fighting to pull us towards the door. With a strange hiss, it let go and turned towards Wheeler, lashing out with a single swipe of its hand. Almost immediately, there was an arterial spray of blood and a death rattle from the officer's lips that made my blood run cold. For a few desperate seconds, the dying man seemed to fumble towards his belt and grab something in his fist. I hoped it was a gun, but instead, his limp hand fell open and revealed a beaten old Zippo lighter and his car keys. I don't know if he meant to, but in that moment, Wheeler saved my life. I grabbed both items and ran as quickly as I could, reaching the steps and refusing to look back for even a second. I lit the Zippo and tossed it behind me, praying to God that this final gambit would work. Something took a swipe at my back, a hot burning sensation followed by a warm trickle that ran down my legs. My final memory before I stumbled face first and hit my head again was one of light and heat, a blinding flash and a terrible warmth that pushed the last glimmers of my consciousness aside and left me drifting in the dark. I never recovered from my time in Elijah's museum, and I never even made it to the car. Police found me having crawled just outside while the entire place went up in flames. The plume of smoke was what caught their attention, and when they arrived, I was soon rushed off to hospital. The death of Wheeler was attributed to a violent attacker, mainly on account of the damage to his body after they pulled it out of the fire. Not just burns, of course, but the slashed throat and damaged vertebrae. Taylor and Keane, while never recovered, were both considered victims of the same attacker. For my part, I never contradicted this theory, but I never could quite bring myself to outright say some crazy addict was the reason for the fire and the men's deaths. Besides, I had my own issues to deal with. Third-degree burns over most of my back and damage to my spine that left me with severe nerve damage. It'd be a lifetime of work just to get back on my feet, so the doctor said back then. As for the museum, I'm glad it went up in smoke, and I'm glad the explosion caused the cave-in down there. My memories of the cave itself are still quite fuzzy, of course. I've relayed as much as I can. We went down, we saw things, then came back. The images the giants pushed into my mind. I'm still not sure how trustworthy they are. I still don't believe Elijah's interpretation of that cave was correct. I don't think the earth is only 6,000 years old, or that the Bible is meant to be taken literally. But they say humans evolved over 1 million years ago. I guess there's a lot of history that got lost along the way. As for Elijah's theory that the conditions of the cave would cause some divine change in humans, well, I can remember him clearly enough to know there was nothing godly about what happened to him. And as for me, the doctors keep scanning me. It was once every 6 months, then 3, then 1. Then I was being called into the hospital damn near every other day, and now they won't even let me out of my room. They won't tell me what's wrong, or why I sometimes wake up to find my back itching like it's covered in 1,000 ants, or why the last nurse who gave me a sponge bath ran out sobbing halfway through. They took me in for surgery a few days ago, and when I woke up, they'd amputated something from my leg, but they wouldn't tell me what. I'm lucky my wife managed to sneak this phone in. It's the only communication I have with the outside world. I'd like to see her again, but I'm not sure I will. I guess I was down in that cave for too long, but I know it's getting worse, and that I don't have much longer. The last doctor who came in wore a hazmat suit, and I'm pretty sure when he left, he was still coughing up blood.
I don't really like committing to things. I'm scared. But when Verizon announced that I could lock in a low price for
I found out my father had died through a terse legal email from a firm I didn't recognize. No condolences, just the subject line that read, "Notice of deceased estate transfer. Urgent response required." Attached were 2 PDFs, one listing my name as contact details and next of kin, and another outlining the property I was set to inherit. A single address in rural Kentucky, a parcel of land just shy of 60 acres, and a 2-story house that had been last appraised in the early 2000s. Beneath that was a line I reread 3 times before I fully registered. Workshop, restricted access, outbuilding number 1, contents presumed hazardous, consult County Code 43B. I hadn't spoken to my father in nearly 20 years. We hadn't fought exactly, just drifted, gradually and inevitably, until the silence between us became the only thing either of us seemed willing to maintain. Even when my mother died, he hadn't called. The funeral passed without a word from him, and I'd learned long ago not to expect anything more. He had his work, and whatever that work became over time, it had consumed him. The drive into the hills brought it all back. That thick, dark stretch of Kentucky forest, the way the road narrowed the further you got from anything with a proper zip code. The GPS cut out an hour before I reached the property line. By then, the trees had thickened into walls on either side of the gravel road, and the shadows between them were so dense it looked more like dusk than early afternoon. I slowed the car almost unconsciously, listening to the crunch of tires on stone, aware that I hadn't seen another vehicle for miles. The house stood at the edge of a clearing, tucked into the tree line as if it knew not to intrude too far. It looked the way I remembered it, tall and tired, with flaking white paint and a porch that sagged in the middle. Ivy had begun its slow, deliberate crawl at one side, wrapping the windows with curling vines. A faded, private property sign hung crookedly from a nail by the door, the lettering half obscured by dirt and weather stains. Inside, the air smelled of dust. The furniture was all intact, though covered in white sheets, the way old houses tend to be in movies, and not so often in real life. His taxidermy tools were still hanging in the hallway, lined up with almost surgical precision. Bone saws, fine wire, curved needles, all clean, all in their place. The fireplace was filled with ash that looked recent, and a mug still sat by the chair in the study, ringed with the brown residue of long evaporated coffee. I didn't go into the workshop right away. After the warning in the letter, I was apprehensive of what I'd find. Still, I walked out to the building, stared at the door, tested the handle, and found it locked. A heavy chain had been run through the bolted latch, the keyhole rusted but not broken. A single weathered tag hung from the handle, tied in place with red thread. Written in a steady hand, the words were simple: "Keep it shut." It didn't surprise me. My father had always treated that space as sacred. When I was 13, he let me watch him mount a fox, hand steady, voice quiet, like a priest in a shrine. I remember the way he stitched the skin back together, humming low under his breath. When I asked why he spent so much time making dead things look alive again, he said without looking up, "Preserving something is the only way to save it from the mountain." At the time, I thought it was a metaphor, a poeticism from a man who saw art in dead things. But there was no mistaking the gravity in his voice when he said it, nor the way he stared at the wall afterward, as if he were listening for something behind it. The town was a 20-minute drive along winding roads, tucked low between the hills. A gas station, a grocery store, a diner. Not much else. When I walked into the grocery store, the woman in the counter looked up, did a double take, and then went completely still. Her expression smoothed out into politeness, but it wasn't the kind born of courtesy. It felt practiced, hesitant. "You're Elijah's boy," she said after a moment, though I hadn't given her a name. I nodded, unsure of the tone in her voice. She gave a faint smile, glanced toward the rear of the store, then quickly added, "Let me know if you need anything." As I walked the aisles, I caught another customer pausing near the produce, eyes tracking me without subtlety. I noticed the man outside the window cross himself once before quickly turning away. It was a quiet reaction, almost instinctive, but it lingered in my head the rest of the day. I didn't think much of it. I assumed it was the kind of tight-knit community awkwardness small towns specialized in. Outsiders were always observed, sometimes resented. I'd forgotten how strange it felt to be somewhere everyone remembered your last name. But it wasn't hostility I felt in those glances. It was something else. Something closer to wariness, or maybe reverence. And behind it all, I could sense a strange question in how they watched me and didn't speak of my father at all. The house creaked with age every time I stepped across the warped floorboards. Though it had been built to last, it hadn't been lived in properly for years, and the weight of silence pressed against the walls harder than any storm ever could. There were signs that my father had lived here until the very end. An old kettle still resting on the stove, slippers placed neatly beside his worn recliner. But there was no warmth left in the rooms, just residue. The mounts were the first thing that started to unsettle me. He had always surrounded himself with his work, and the living room was no exception. Heads stared out from the walls, a red fox with matted fur, a hawk frozen in mid-screech, a dozen squirrels with arched backs and glassy, frozen tension in their limbs. A bobcat posed on the mantel, one paw extended, mouth drawn back in a snarl. But the expression didn't read as predatory. It looked surprised, almost embarrassed. Each of the eyes had the same strange quality I remembered from when I was young, too reflective and focused, as if the gaze followed even when you turned your back. Some of the animals weren't posed for realism at all. A possum on the corner shelf was sitting upright in a child's chair, dressed in a doll's clothing, paws folded in its lap. A raccoon on the bookshelf had spectacles resting on its snout, and a tiny copy of Walden glued into its paws. My father had often done this kind of thing, treated his taxidermy as preservation and storytelling. He used to joke that animals deserve to be remembered not for how they died, but for who they could have been. I hadn't laughed the last time he said it. I wasn't sure if it was meant to be comforting or a warning. I didn't find the key until that evening, when I was thumbing through the shelves in his study. Most of the books were what you'd expect: anatomy manuals, wildlife field guides, a few volumes on mortuary science. But wedged between two copies of a leather-bound family Bible was a much older edition, heavy and dry with age. I instinctively opened it and found a hollow carved out in the middle. Nestled inside was a single iron key wrapped in cloth. On the opposite page, the entire section of Leviticus had been torn out. Not cut, not carefully removed, ripped by hand, as if in anger or urgency. Outside, the grass was knee-high, wild and overgrown, thick with seed heads. Beyond the rusting garden gate stood the workshop. It was taller than I remembered, with a pitched roof and windowless walls wrapped in thick ivy. Every nail, every board seemed carefully placed. It had the look of something that had been built slowly, with enormous patience and no intention of ever being abandoned. The lock on the door was old brass, darkened from years of weather. I'd already found the chain earlier, looped tight and secured with a keyed padlock. My father had always guarded his workspace, but now it felt more like a warning than a barrier. I didn't wait until morning. The key fit the padlock perfectly, and the chain fell away. The door opened easier than the others that fell to disrepair, revealing a darkness that smelled of cedar wood, dust, and the faintest trace of chemical sweetness. I reached for the light and found the pull cord, which snapped down with a metallic click. Fluorescent lights buzzed to life overhead, flickering once before settling. The space was much larger than I remembered. The walls were lined with shelves of labeled jars and plastic storage tubs. At the far end stood an industrial-grade workbench with a leather stool beside it, tools arranged above with obsessive precision. There were bones on the shelves, tiny skulls, preserved eyes, threads, needles, bottles of tanning solution, wires and foam molds. His entire world was kept in perfect order. But what caught my attention was the covered form. It was shrouded in beige drop cloths, still and absent, but I could see the suggestion of limbs beneath the fabric. Arms folded across chests, legs slightly bent, the outlines of heads that seemed too round, too soft. I pulled the cover off. Beneath it was a figure, human-shaped, about the size of an adolescent child, though thinner, with elongated limbs and a narrowed waist. The skin was stitched tight over the form, pale and patchworked, with subtle shifts in colour and texture that told me it had not come from one source. The hands were too small, the feet are too broad. But what freaked me out was what it looked to be made of. Animal parts were cobbled together to make the amalgamation of shapes. The torso was seamless, but the shoulders looked animal, slightly hunched, ridged beneath the surface. The face was calm, serene even, eyes open, mouth parted just enough to suggest breath. It was an abomination, a sick imitation of human life. The eyes were glass, of course. They weren't the mass-produced kind you ordered from a taxidermy supplier. They looked custom, too real. I couldn't explain it beyond a gut reaction. I'd seen hundreds of mounted animals in my life, and I even helped preserve a few. But this was something else. I stared at it longer than I meant to, trying to make sense of the proportions, the materials, the reason. It had to be some artistic experiment, a commission maybe, something for a gallery or a private collector with odd tastes. My father had always flirted with art as much as science. Still, I dropped the cloth back over the figure before leaving the workshop, and when I turned off the light, I could have sworn it had shifted slightly in the dark. I found her at the bar on the edge of town, the one with a rusted jukebox and a pool table that hadn't seen a straight queue in 20 years. It was early afternoon, and the place was empty except for a few old men nursing long-warmed beer and the woman behind the counter. She looked up when I walked in, eyes narrowing briefly before recognition softened her expression. "You're Elijah's boy," she said, wiping her hand on a towel. "Didn't think you'd ever show." "I wasn't planning to," I replied, "but here I am." She gestured to a stool and poured me something amber without asking. I took it. Her name was Ruth. I remembered her now in pieces. She'd been older than me when we were kids, maybe 8 or 9 years older, and had worked in this bar even back then. She still wore her dark hair tied up, and there was a silver ring on her nose that looked recent. Her eyes held a mixture of curiosity and caution. We talked about nothing for a while. Weather, power outages, and
Hello? Hello? Gwendolyn,
Hey, I'm
can
on
you hear
stream.
me?
Don't say anything crazy.
Hello.
What's good?
Oh, I know. No, not much. Just, I was wondering what's happening with my girl, How you doing?
We're eating lunch. Say hi, Lucy. No, his name is Lucas. Say hi, Lucas. Did you hear that?
No, but who's this other bitch she's saying hi to?
Hey, say hi, Lucas. Did you hear that now?
Ah, yeah, I heard it.
Yeah. Spoiled.
All of a sudden, I forgot whoever that other person was she was saying hi to.
That's crazy. Oh, what are you
I'm
doing?
about
Are
to
you
pull
still
into
at
the
work?
driveway.
Oh. Oh, so we finna play
I
something.
just got off.
That's what I heard.
See, we'll see, we'll see.
We'll see. Man, you gotta get scum, man. This game is
I have
so
scum.
fun. Do you really? Okay, so we should play that.
I have scum. I just pulled it off my wiener this morning.
That's gross. Horrible. Terrible.
Or I should say peeled off.
Jail.
You should see my neighbor's puppy. It's like some kind of, it might be a purebred, but it's like a cane corso. No, it's a cane corso mastiff mix.
Aww. I'm so jealous.
See it out there in the yard playing. It's Brindle.
Mm.
I see him walking in circles around a pole. And now he's stuck. I'm gonna go over there and help him. Fuck.
How is he stuck on a pole?
He's on a lead and he just walked there. I just watched him walk a circle around this pole.
Ah, phenomenal.
I'm gonna go rescue him. I'm surprised Dalton's not out here. Oh, he's probably in my house.
He's probably on the computer.
Oh God. His dogs are going ham. I'll call you when I get inside.
All right, bro. I'll be here. I'll just be in Discord.
then a storm that had rolled through the valley a week before. She asked about the house, and I told her it was just as I remembered. We didn't talk about my father, not at first. It hung between us, though, thick and obvious.
Here, hold on.
Eventually, after a second cigarette and my third drink, I'd asked the question I'd been holding in since I arrived. What was my father really doing up there? She exhaled slowly, eyes flicking to the window. A wind pushed the curtain of dust across the empty parking lot. She didn't answer at first. She just pulled out another cigarette and lit it with a match that she struck against the bar's metal edge. You ever hear about the missing children? She asked. I shook my head. They don't talk about it anymore, not officially, but people remember. She looked past me now, her voice steady but low. It used to be every couple of months a kid would vanish. No struggle, no noise, just gone. Folks blame the woods, wild animals, running away. But they never found bodies, not one. Just toys left in the fields, shoes by the riverbanks. I listened, feeling the chill settle into my spine. Town almost up and left. But then your great-grandfather showed up, she continued. Stranger back then, didn't belong here. But he built the house and set up a shop, started doing odd jobs for the town. Kept to himself mostly. Then, around the time he finished that workshop of his, the disappearances stopped. What does that have to do with me? I asked, though the answer was starting to form. Your family's never really been part of us, not in the normal way. But when things got quiet, people let it be. No more missing kids, no more mothers waking up to empty cribs. And the ones who remembered just told their children and their children's children to stay away from the ridge.
Yeah.
I frowned. The ridge? Ruth stubbed out a cigarette and finally looked at me. You never went up there as a kid, did you? No, I said slowly. My father wouldn't let me. That much was true. I remembered the day I'd asked about it. I was 10. It had been the end of summer, the air sticky and still, and I'd wandered too far past the tree line behind the house. When I got back, my father had been waiting. Not even angry in the usual way, but the way his face had looked. White, hollow, terrified. That stuck with me more than any punishment ever could. He grabbed my arm, pulled me into the workshop, and told me to never go beyond the ridge again. Not alone, not at dusk. His voice had cracked when he said it. You can smell grief, he whispered, like it was a fact of nature. That's what it waits for. At the time, I thought he was talking about a bear, or maybe something more metaphorical. A lesson in coping with loss, or how sadness leaves you vulnerable. But now, I wasn't so sure. Ruth poured another drink and leaned on the bar. Your grandfather took over after your great-grandfather died, then your father after him. That house isn't just a house. That workshop isn't just a studio. They were preservers. That's what they were called, though not out loud. You were either born into it or you weren't, and your family always was. Preservers of what? I asked. She didn't answer at first, just shook her head. Whatever's out there, she finally said. Whatever your family was holding at bay. I laughed, but it came out thin and strained. You really believe that? I don't need to believe it, she said. I just remember what happened the one time there wasn't a preserver. Your father left for a year after your mother passed. Do you remember that? I shook my head, but asked her to continue. There were 2 kids taken in that gap, and when your father returned, reopened the workshop and started working again, they stopped. I didn't know what to say to that, didn't know how to process it. It sounded absurd. But then again, so did the figure in the workshop, the child, the seams, the glass eyes. People won't say it out loud, she continued, but they're watching you because you're Elijah's son. I drained the rest of my drink and sat in silence, the taste lingering on my tongue like ash. By the third day, I'd started making a checklist. There were utility companies to call, property records to transfer, and a dozen minor errands I hadn't anticipated. The sooner everything was handled, the sooner I could get the house listed and gone. That was the plan. No need to stay longer than necessary. I returned to the town with a folder of documents tucked under one arm and a list of questions in my phone, hoping for a few straightforward conversations. What I found instead was more of that quiet, sidelong energy I couldn't quite pin down. It was in the way people greeted me with soft smiles that didn't reach their eyes, or the way conversations seemed to pause when I stepped too close. At the county clerk's office, I asked about transferring the property. The woman behind the desk was pleasant, but vague. "There's a few steps," she said, flipping through the binder that looked older than she was. "You'll need to file locally. Probably have to wait on county sign-off." "How long does that usually take?" She blinked. "Depends." "On what?" She offered another smile and glanced toward the hallway behind her. "Lots of things, but we'll do our best to help. Don't you worry." It wasn't refusal, yet it didn't feel like a straight answer either. The whole conversation felt padded with something too soft to push through. At the utility office, I tried to disconnect the water and electricity. The man behind the glass told me the system was in a backlog. When I pressed for details, he shrugged and said I might be better off waiting a bit before I filed. The grocery store was no better. The same woman from earlier still remembered my name and still asked about the house again. There was a cautious distance behind her tone. She offered me a discount at the register I hadn't asked for. The man behind me muttered something I didn't catch, and she gave him a quick glare. No one spoke after that. I drove back to the house with the windows down, trying to shake off the feeling. Maybe it was just rural bureaucracy. Maybe small towns really were this awkward around outsiders, and I had forgotten what it was like to be watched for nothing more than showing off. Still, the sense of being surrounded by people who were waiting for something I hadn't agreed to kept crawling back in. I didn't know what they expected. I wasn't staying. I had a job, a life, a home far from here. All I wanted was to get things in order and move on. As I sat on the porch, nursing a warm beer that evening, a man pulled into the drive. He stepped out of an old pickup, moved slowly and deliberately, with the kind of confidence that comes from being part of a place for too long to question it. He introduced himself as Vernon Mott, said he was part of the local historical society, though the way he said it gave the impression that his title was more about tradition than any real bureaucracy. His shirt was clean, tucked into faded jeans, and he wore a black belt with a silver buckle that had been worn smooth from decades of use. He had the kind of face that looked older than it probably was, all deep lines and windburn. We talked politely for a few minutes. He asked how I was settling in, whether I needed anything. I told him I appreciated the help, but what I really needed was information. Namely, how to speed up the paperwork, how to get the utilities handled, Why, everyone seemed to stall when I mentioned selling the place. His mouth twitched. Not a smile, not quite. More of a sigh escaped his lips. I can't speak for everyone, he said. They mean well. It's just not easy. Not easy to what? I asked. Let go of the house? Deal with outsiders? He looked down at his boots, then back up at me. They're not afraid of you, he said. They're afraid you won't stay. I didn't answer. Not right away. His words hit with more weight than I expected. This wasn't suspicion. This was something closer to resignation. A town bracing for something they feared might happen again. I'm not planning to stay, I admitted. I never was. I figured, he said. You've got that look. Same one your father had when he left the first time. I stared at him. I'm not judging, he added, but I know what happens when the house goes empty. I've seen it. He paused, then glanced toward the tree line beyond the yard. His tone changed. I won't ask you to believe anything. Not yet. But I'll ask you this. Come meet me at the ridge, past the tree line, just after sunset. For what? I asked. He didn't answer right away, just stepped back toward his truck. To understand, he said finally. Nothing more. Then he left. No goodbye, no pressure, just the sound of his tires grinding down the gravel road until they disappeared into the dark.
You're very welcome here.
Thank you. God bless you guys. We're holding on so tight, Father.
The sun had already begun to dip when I found Vernon waiting just beyond the split rail fence at the edge of the property. As I approached, he gave a silent, shallow nod and turned toward the woods. I followed without a word, the only sound between us the crunch of dried leaves underfoot and the rasp of wind filtering through the canopy. The trees thickened quickly, pressing in from both sides. Paths weren't marked out here. Whatever trail we followed was made through memory alone, worn by years of footfall rather than signs or blazes. Brambles reached toward us, snagging at our sleeves. A low fog coiled near the roots, carrying the damp scent of moss and iron. After 15 minutes of walking in silence, Vernon raised one hand to hold me. His voice was quiet but heavy. From here on, you must not speak. Don't even breathe too loudly. If it hears us, it may not understand. I nodded once, not trusting myself to ask what he meant. We moved slower after that, picking our way through the thickets of ferns and roots slick with decay. The light dimmed rapidly, the woods grew still. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my own breath and the occasional crack of twigs underfoot. Eventually, the forest opened into a clearing. It was not shaped naturally. The trees along the edges had bowed inward, their branches reaching toward each other overhead like the ribs of a collapsed lung. At the center of the clearing sat something I had no words for. At first, I thought it was part of the forest. A massive shape hunched low, covered in layers of bark and moss. But then it shifted, and I saw the seams. The movement was slow, almost graceful, and entirely wrong. It was enormous, crouched in the clearing like a thing too large for the world around it. Its body was a patchwork of flesh and hide, stitched together by time and instinct. Some parts moved with the weight of muscle beneath skin, while others creaked like dry branches being bent too far. Its shape was loosely human in structure, but warped by growth and time, and some fundamental misunderstanding of form. Its shoulders were broad, sloping downward into arms that ended in elongated hands, each finger tipped with a different claw or hoof. Tufts of hair sprouted along its back. A jaw protruded from beneath one shoulder, mismatched and slack. But it was the way it held the thing in its arms that froze me in place. It was cradling something, a figure roughly the size of a child, though lumpy and slumped in strange ways, as if its limbs had softened or rotted inward. The skin was pale and patchy, its arms wrapped tight around its midsection. I could see stitches unraveling across its neck, the head lolling at an angle that suggested it might not be fully attached anymore. The creature stroked the figure gently, its oversized fingers adjusting an arm, tucking a loose flap of skin back into place. It rocked the child slowly, rhythmically, with the soft urgency of something that did not understand time, but felt it slipping away. I could not move, could not look away. The thing it held reminded me too much of what I'd found in the workshop. The same glassy stillness, the same too long limbs and sagging expression. But this one was older, broken down, handled too much. It looked like it had been played with for far too long. Vernon leaned in close, barely breathing, and whispered into the edge of my ear. We call it the parent. It sits here and plays with its child. And it's almost done with...
Hello? I ended up getting food too.
What'd you get?
I just warmed up some plain white rice.
My favorite.
I gotta watch my weight.
Okay, well, that's not gonna help you with that, but okay.
Just trying to lower my calories.
That's still not gonna help you with that. Rice is all carbs. Carbs process into sugar.
True.
And while it is true that you need that to burn weight, because most of our energy comes from carbs, you still need like veggies and proteins.
I might have a little bit of that salad later. We got a salad in there too.
One of the best things you can do to slim down is eat a shit ton of chicken.
Because then you get that protein you need.
Yep, it's one of the highest protein, low fat meats that you can get your hands on cheaply.
Maybe I'll stop by a KFC tomorrow.
That's not what I was looking for. You're going to jail. Sit down and eat your food, please. I'm making chicken tonight, actually.
You free to take the trip and talk to Gary?
Yeah. Just holler at me when. Just holler at me when.
You need a ride back, right? Someone to follow me.
You need a ride back.
Why need?
Aren't you taking the Dodge down there? Yeah, whenever you take the Dodge down there, just holler at me before and I'll give you a ride back. Yeah, but you can take the Dodge down there.
Is that Alex?
Yeah. We're gonna take the Dodge back down to Thomas's to have some electrical stuff done. Oots, oots.
She can't hear you.
Ah,
Yeah. She's
almost.
supposed to be finishing her food.
Where's he down there?
I don't think I have the number saved. You can ask him. He's probably not down there right now. We probably just have to drop it off.
Because it's your nap time. You're supposed to be. I can't wait for Subnautica to come out, man.
Yeah.
Ready?
Oh, yep. You're coming. You're coming with me on an adventure, Quinlan.
Say less.
I'm just riding down to
That's
Thomas's.
my favorite. No, you need to wait.
Oh,
Beans, I just said you needed to wait.
To the he doesn't tell them in that house,
And yet you did.
awesome.
so they can still get stuff inside and outside.
Yeah, it should be.
It's your actions have consequences.
When you start it up, keep your left foot on the brake, and if you need to, use your right foot and give it just a little bit of throttle. Not too much. And don't get pulled over. You got empty beer cans back there.
Oh shit, definitely don't get pulled over.
Not that I'm just fucking with you, Alex.
What the fuck?
If you got pulled over for having empty beer cans, I'd have been fucked.
Yeah, no shit.
My truck bed was full of them.
Holy fuck, man.
It's just not for driving, but like it's just convenient. Like when I'm either driving the truck around the yard or like walking around.
Beans.
Beans.
Fucking biter boy. Quit biting. Biter no biting.
Have you seen the map?
The what?
That is Derek. Oh my god.
Say
Jesus
what?
Christ.
Huh?
Map?
None.
Alex is trying to find reverse right now and he is struggling. He found it. Turn your wheel. Come on, buddy. Oh, I should have drove it down there. Oh, God.
There you go, buddy.
Oh, God.
Get the hookers off you.
The neighbors know he's a bad driver, so everybody was shaking.
You are cutting in and out so bad, bro.
Oh, sorry, I don't have service.
No, you're good. I mean, I know. I'm just letting you know. I ain't hearing all of what you're saying. Well, just let me eat the damn grapes.
Oh God, they're speeding.
Oh, great.
Well, because it's a 35 right, but they were going more than 35.
Gotta love it. Okay, eat your food. Eat your food. You know what you need to be doing. It's your nap time. And you're being a slowpoke because you don't want to go to nap time. Beans quit.
Actually, Thomas might be here. It looks like his truck. You left the keys in it, didn't you? I'd probably shut that window. It's gonna rain later this week. I'm gonna show Alex my new gun.
Yeah. What kind was it? You didn't tell me.
Smith & Wesson MP10 Performance Center. Do you want to see my new gun I bought?
You did tell me.
Is it clean?
It shoots 10 millimeter. Shoots big old bullets. It's a Smith & Wesson MP10 Performance Center, so it's got like a slotted barrel on the top. You can rack it. And then to get it to slide down, yeah, you just pull that down, but it'll go fast when I let it your finger. You just gotta use man strength. That one, yep. Man strength. There you go. I haven't told Mom about it, so. You wanna shoot it sometime?
Yes.
It's cool.
And the tactical one.
The what?
Tactical one. So the airflow in this. That's it.
Yeah, it's the fancy one. It's not just a right. It's the performance. Yeah. Under burnout. You're so lame. I have my dab pen. Good, because I don't have one. Dude, those illegal drugs.
Nerd emoji.
It is when you're underage, dumbass. Although technically, I could buy them for you now, just so you know.
Yeah, phones in there, see?
I have. If he texts me or I have his number, I can give it to. If you like pina colada, getting caught in the rain. If you like getting touched by a dude while he touches your butt.
Definitely the right month for that.
Oh yeah, it is Pride Month.
Yep.
my headset.
I can hear the difference. Wow.
That much worse?
Yeah.
Fuck. I almost bit the bullet on getting one not too long ago. New headset. I could get the Logitech G Astro Omni Platform Wireless for $400.
That's insane. Mine are 50.
Yeah, but you use a microphone, don't you?
Yeah, that's true.
Fuck. I didn't open up this beer.
Bro, just get you a regular ass, like a podcast mic. They're not that expensive.
I'm so glad. I don't know. You don't know Christopher, do you, Susan's kid? Chris?
No, fuck no.
Oh my gosh, you would like him. Big pothead.
That doesn't mean anything.
I thought all potheads kind of like resonate.
No.
I could have swore it was like a rule unless
What does that have to do
they
with
did
you being
something
a
against you.
podcast mic?
Oh, I was just opening up this beer and I remembered he taught me like I can open up a beer with anything. I just reached over and grabbed a fork and just popped it right off, no problem.
That's nice, I guess. Yeah, you gotta get you a podcast mic, bro. They're super easy to set up, they're not that expensive, and you don't sound like shit. I know you heard me.
What'd you say? Getting the mic. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sorry, I was reading about actually mics right now. I just looked up mics to get.
The one we got is Mauno brand.
Okay.
Pretty good. Okay, check your DMs.
That one.
Oh, I see. Ooh, I'm gonna get a
I
whole
turned my
boom
head
set up.
slightly, eyes
I
still
mean,
locked
yeah,
on the clearing.
it's like it moves. You can move it out of the way and shit. Cause it's on
Okay.
an arm. I put it behind my.
For when I have that way when I have big booty Latina bitches sitting in my lap, I don't have to worry about the microphone getting in the way.
That would never happen.
Yeah.
Quit.
If you like pina coladas.
Oh!
Excuse you.
Finish your food and you're gonna go to bed. I know you're being grumpy because of it. Finish chewing.
Yep. What do you want?